Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Guiding Your Supply Chain podcast. Today, we're honored to have James Malley as our guest. He is the CEO and co-founder of Paccurate. Thanks, James, for being on with us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm excited to be here.
Yeah, so to get started, why don't you tell us a little bit about Paccurate, how the company got started, and what you guys do?
Sure. So Paccurate helps shippers pack things more efficiently. So, I think most of us have this experience of ordering something online and it showing up in a big box and the thing you order is rattling around somewhere in the bottom. That's what we help prevent as kind of a starting place. We really got started on R&D back in like 2016, 2017. And a bunch of small shippers. And then it wasn't really until the pandemic hit that our customer base grew, and we started getting larger, kind of recognizable name brands using our algorithms.
Awesome. So you guys, I guess you started in 2016. Is that when things got off the ground?
Yeah, it was a little, my co-founder Pat and I, our background is in kind of freelance work for supply chain tech. So we would help with integrating shipping systems or writing connectors between, moving order data between different systems, things like that. We even built a fully functional web-based shipping system at one point, but we were guns for hire. So around the time when we got tired of that was when FedEx and UPS started really penalizing poor packing, at least more than they had been in the past. And so some of the shippers that we had done work for said, how do we deal with this? We're moving, shipments as fast as we can through the fulfillment center, but the packers don't have really reliable instructions for how to put these things in the boxes. What do we do? And so we just kind of took that on, and we thought, well, we can take a crack at it. That's how it kind of started.
Okay, yeah. So you mentioned most of us have had that experience where you receive a package, something you ordered, and it comes in a package that's way too big, way bigger than it needs to be. It's funny you mentioned that. Just for my wife's birthday was earlier in December, and she got some makeup. She got this tube of lipstick, and I took a picture of it. It came in this box, way too big, and there were all the packing pillows underneath, and the tube of lipstick was at the very top, so it wasn't even like protected. And it was just like, this could have come in a tiny little mailer and like didn't need any of this. So
Totally.
it's definitely a problem that's widespread. But I guess, why is it so widespread? Why is it not dealt with readily? And why, from like an executive standpoint or from a company standpoint, why is it kind of seems like it's pushed to the back burner?
Yeah. Well, first of all, I think, as e-commerce, it hasn't really slowed down, despite whatever the economy seems to be doing. Obviously, there's some ebbs and flows, but e-commerce continues to rise, at least as a percentage of total retail. So it's kind of more of a common experience to receive that mostly empty box. And you don't have to be a supply chain person to kind of intuitively understand that something went wrong, especially because you're lugging this stuff out to the recycling or whatever, grumbling to yourself. You can kind of intuit that this was, waste of material. It took up too much space, precious space really in the supply chain. And I think we just hit a point where, really the beginning of this year is where we started to see negative unboxing videos, or it's like kind of packaging shaming videos, because it used to be any sort of social media buzz was good for your brand, but often companies reach out to us when they're being kind of eviscerated on social media for bad careless packing. And I think it's not really the fault of the packers in the warehouse, because they're under tremendous pressure just to get all the orders of the day out the door, onto the UPS or FedEx truck. And humans in general are just kind of really bad at eyeballing three-dimensional space. And so that kind of coupled with rising costs, the GRI we just had was pretty brutal. I think that's caused kind of a pretty sharp shift in the way that e-commerce, but shippers in general think about this problem.
So GRI, is that general rate increase? I'm guessing with like
Yeah,
UPS and FedEx.
right. I think it was 6.9% or something in that
Yeah,
ballpark.
I saw that number, and that's like a minimum, probably.
Yeah, it's brutal, and I mean they do all kinds of hand waving to, renegotiate your contract so maybe it doesn't feel as painful. But I mean, across the board, the prices are going up.
Hmm.
So there's only so many things you can turn to kind of mitigate that really, margin eroding cost. And that's kind of making things a little bit more efficient upstream. And so we focus on not just the packing, but doing kind of deep analysis on which cartons you have in stock and telling people which cartons to buy for their specific fulfillment setup.
Okay. So for the average consumer who doesn't really think about the behind the scenes, I'm on your website, I add something to my cart, I click purchase, I maybe track the shipment to my door, and it shows up in a box way too big, and it's kind of frustrating. Can you explain to us where cartonization comes in, or I guess the fulfillment process, where I as a customer hit purchase, what happens after that until it gets to my door?
Sure. So typically your order goes into an order management system of some kind. And everybody seems to have a different setup of which systems they use, but in a kind of typical by the book way, it goes into an order management system which figures out where it should be fulfilled from. And then eventually it makes its way to a WMS system at one or more locations that's dropping, we call it an order wave drop. But at the beginning of the day, those orders that have been determined that they're going to be fulfilled from this warehouse gets kind of dropped in there into the systems in this warehouse and starts, kicking off things like picking, whether it's human or robotic, to get these things from the shelves. And then those either got brought over in a bin or put onto a conveyor belt to a pack station. And usually there's a person there whose job it is to scan the items, make sure they're the right ones based on what they see on their screen, and then pick the appropriate box. And so in the past, when I think, WMS systems tend to have a kind of a lightweight cartonization feature that all it's really doing is comparing the total cubic volume of the items in the order to the total available cubic volume in the boxes that may be sitting there at the pack station in a rack. This can cause lots of problems at scale because if you imagine a shovel may have a lower total volume than a box, but it's still going to put a hole through it probably. So that hasn't worked so well. So when as costs continue to rise, shippers have kind of looked for more advanced versions of that. We call it cartonization. That's the step of figuring out which box it should go in. And so you have 3D cartonization, and then you have what we do, which is a little bit more holistic, where we're looking at material costs, labor costs, transportation rate tables, and all the algorithms kind of processing all that and then spitting out packing instructions with a visual of how the item should be packed in the box. So if everything in that whole process goes well, you have one or more boxes show up on your doorstep that are tightly packed with only enough dunnage or fill to protect the item perfectly, but ideally no air whatsoever.
Okay, so typically, so for someone who's not using, AI or an algorithm to determine carton size, how have companies, or how are they currently determining, we need 10 different carton sizes? Like, I guess, how are they picking what carton sizes they should have and use, and how are
Gotcha.
pickers picking those?
Gotcha. Yeah. So for the question of which cartons should I buy to keep for use in my distribution center, is that what you're asking about?
Yeah.
Yeah. So this has historically been kind of a consulting exercise, where you hire packaging consultants and they kind of look at top line kind of KPIs, and they actually do some pretty sophisticated math to try to react to your current costs and how many of your boxes are empty of this percent air, etc. And then they come up with a recommendation of how you could change your box mix so that there's more boxes that are perfect for each shipment that you do. The problem with this is it's kind of reactive. So you're still kind of assuming that the baseline box mix is ideal in some way. Maybe, you're just trying to improve upon it. And so we kind of took a different approach where we took our kind of real-time cartonization engine and turned it into basically a big analysis brain. So you can upload, a big set of order data, and the engine will run through packing each shipment. Maybe you upload 1 million shipments. Each of those shipments needs to be tried, thousands of times, and then eventually through that process, it identifies the perfect carton set. To our knowledge, there hasn't been anything like it before. I do think that some consultants do a really good job, but we kind of look at the problem a little bit differently. We look at it as kind of a simulation problem, more than anything.
Okay. So it's different than, say, like printing right size packaging for based on, whatever items are going into your order.
Well, both have definitely their uses. I mean, our API, which instructs people how to pack, can also be used to instruct box making machines in real time. Those tend to be the best way of removing as much air as possible for any given shipment. Because even if we're able to identify, okay, here's the 8 perfect boxes based on all of your shipping costs and history, that's not going to be custom, per shipment. Whereas if you have one of these machines, it's definitely the best way of eliminating all that air. I think what we've started to find is that the difference between having the perfect box set and having a box making machine, there's a big difference in cubic utilization, but the transportation cost implications are not that big. So it really comes down to, if you ship a lot of custom items, that's huge. Those machines are perfect, but it's kind of a case by case basis.
Okay. So you mentioned earlier that I guess the goal is to have everything show up on your doorstep tightly packaged with just enough, dunnage or filler to protect the material. And I read an article that you wrote about, parcel shipping, and I think the title was like the $46 billion issue with it, kind of. And you mentioned in there that typical cartonization, people look to just reduce space, but there are other factors that people should be looking at or should be concerned with that can also, add to cost savings. What are those other factors that people should be looking at?
Well, like a lot of kind of touch points in supply chain and fulfillment, you can really go down the rabbit hole of optimization. It's this kind of thing that converts ordinary civilians into huge supply chain nerds, which happen to us. But in the past, it was fine to use, we call it cubic utilization, or how much of this cube are you actually using in each package. It was kind of fine to use that as a stand-in for lowest cost. But as the kind of pain of fulfillment and the cost of fulfillment rise, we saw a need to optimize further, where it's not just what's the smallest box that everything fits in. It's, what does your carrier rate table say about this? Because the rate table, both carriers, or all carriers really, want you to minimize the number of cartons that you're shipping as well as the air in those cartons. So those two things. But in their rate tables, they incentivize one of those things over the other, depending on where you're shipping something, what your, the service type is, all these other factors. And so that's sort of what we started with, with what we call cost-aware cartonization, where we're following the incentives that the carriers have kind of baked in there. As an example, if you're shipping, something far away to Zone 9, like Hawaii, more often than not, they're going to want you to split up the shipment into multiple boxes if necessary to squeeze every little bit of air out. because it's more efficient for air freight. If you're shipping something next door, they may care more about handling, and so they don't care as much about air in there. They just want it easy to handle and deliver. So that's one thing. Another example is 3PLs in particular really have a good handle on what their labor costs are like, because they often don't pay the actual shipping themselves. So they know almost definitively what the additional cost is per year if on average their packers are opening a second box. So all of these, and that's just one example, but there's also material costs. There may be some cases where if you have an expensive branded box, you don't want, the transportation savings of splitting it up into two boxes is outweighed by the cost of the material or labor. So these are just some examples, but there's just a lot that goes into what is the cost optimal way of packing.
Yeah. So if I understanding correctly, this, I mean, to me as like, I guess an average consumer, it seems counterintuitive that it could be cheaper to ship two separate boxes to me, cross country than everything in one box.
Well, one way of thinking about it is the supply chain is vast. FedEx and UPS deliver 41 million packages per day around the world, but it's not infinite. There's not infinite capacity, and in particular, when you're talking about long haul shipments or air shipments, capacity and space are at a premium. And so, if you're able to reduce the total cubic volume of your shipment, that may require splitting it up into two smaller boxes as opposed to one that happens to have some extra air in there. But that's kind of a partial explanation, I guess, but you could see how it's really kind of down the rabbit hole.
Yeah.
How two boxes could actually be, net out to better for the environment.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a big part of all this too. Cartonization, reducing box sizes, fewer boxes is the sustainability aspect of it. I'm sure that's probably a big, I guess, selling point for you guys when you are discussing your software with potential customers. Do you have any, I guess, data or statistics on sustainability aspect and how that's improved by using a cartonization software or API like you guys offer?
Sure. I don't have good figures for kind of legacy cartonization, but what the data we have for our solution is we see an average reduction of corrugate, like the cardboard used, by a square foot per package. So, for some of our biggest customers, that's hundreds of acres of cardboard per year. So that's one thing, and that's kind of easier to do the math on the sustainability implications, because while we look at paper and cardboard as better than plastic, which is true because it's more recyclable, there's still a carbon footprint associated with it. I think it's 1 ton of cardboard equals 3 tons of CO2 equivalent released in its production. So that one's kind of easy to connect the dots when we're going in and talking to a shipper about how they can meet their ESG goals. But the other side of it is a little bit more complicated, and that's what's the impact that you're having on the network, on the supply chain. Well, we can kind of look at some interesting data of what's your immediate impact, which is, especially if you're doing floor-loaded trailers, if you're able to reduce the average size of the packages you ship by 14%, which we've seen pretty commonly be the figure for that. That also reduces the number of truck trips over time that you're going to need to send out by 14%, because at scale, this kind of acts like a liquid in a weird way. And so that's pretty massive, at least to know that you need, one of our large customers, it was 400 trucks.
Wow. That's, yeah, that's quite the improvement in their sustainability for sure. I was going to ask too, so with all this cartonization going on and picking, optimal cartons and things, what inputs, I guess, are required beforehand and able to make all of that work how it should?
Well, I'm glad you asked that question because dimensions are pretty critical. Um, Good dimensions. It's with any kind of deep optimization like this, it's really garbage in, garbage out. And when we started with Paccurate and the API, it seemed like nobody had good dimensions. And so, when we would first talk to a company, they would say, "Oh, this is great. I'm so excited. Now I need to go figure out how to capture dimensions. And so I'll talk to you in a month or something." Now it's better. I mean, with vendors like Cubiscan, to give a plug there, it's gotten so much better because the technology available to get those dimensions is so much better. Even companies that have maybe purchased some of these machines a while ago are kind of dusting them off and incorporating them into their receiving process. So receiving is, in the warehouse when you get new product to keep in stock. A lot of our customers have set up kind of a step in receiving where they profile the item, just to make sure that they know the exact specs here. So they'll put it on a Cubiscan, do the measurement, and then maybe make a note of what kind of item it is so that the cartonization algorithms can be most effective. But once that's in place, it's really just the more information about a shipment you can provide, the more optimal that shipment can be. So at a minimum, it's item dimensions and what boxes do you have. But then you get into, business rules and rate tables and all this stuff as well.
Okay. I would guess some of like what kind of item you're packaging is important as well, with like how fragile or how if it requires
Totally.
some kind of special, packaging.
Totally. Can it be stacked, nested, rolled, turned upside? All those kind of things. Crate and Barrel was one of our first kind of large customers that came in during the pandemic. As you can imagine, they don't just have one kind of fragile.
Yeah.
There's a they have all kinds of things that are fragile in different ways. Some can't be packed with certain other things. Some can be stacked, some can't. So getting an understanding of how to translate those requirements, which were previously just kind of locked away as tribal knowledge, translating those into code basically and to be able to call our API and tell the algorithm how to behave for any given item or shipment. That was pretty key.
Yeah. So, and maybe I'm naive here, but I feel like most people, if they have cartonization software, it's probably sort of a legacy form of it. Um, I guess what can they do now? Like, what's a small win now that they can do to work towards something like this, where they can, package more efficiently? Or, I guess at what point do people get or companies get to a point where they should look into something like this?
Yeah, I mean, we have customers that ship, a few hundred things a month that we've never talked to. So they come up, sign up, and the amount that you're going to save on transportation is different, but the percentages are generally the same. So there's, whenever, I mean, whenever there's any kind of momentum internally in your company about increasing profitability, that's when you should look at the packing step, particularly in e-com, where there's all this other overhead. But the first step is look at your data, make sure it's good, make sure you have a strategy for keeping that data. Sometimes, with larger companies, there's some complexity around who owns the item master. Are the ops people allowed to
Mm-hmm.
modify it, or is there a separate kind of record of this stuff? And I don't think it's an accident that there's some really cool software that's come out in recent years for tracking this stuff. Item master management software, SpecRite comes to mind. But yeah, yeah. Well, as long as you think there's an appetite for becoming more green, and making a small change that has pretty widespread repercussions, it's a good time.
Yeah. Yeah. It seems like it'd be kind of um, I guess, minimal change for a pretty big impact,
Yeah,
possibly
and
within a
uh,
company.
th- the Packers tend to really like it. You'd think, I think when we started the company, we were worried, is this going to be too much of a pain for the actual Packers in the warehouse? But we've got nothing but good feedback because we've taken the responsibility out of their hands. So they're not going to get into any sort of trouble for damage or anything. They just don't have to worry about that. They just have to look at the instructions, pack it, and go about their day.
Yeah. So it sounds like for, I mean, anybody who's shipping at all, a small win or a way to start would be, make sure you have accurate data on your SKUs, your product SKUs going out the door, and then, test out the API,
Yeah,
see how it works, play around with it, and try and get more, I guess, standard and correct carton sizes for your shipments going out.
absolutely.
Um, I saw another interesting, I guess, statistic in, I think it was part of that article or the article that you wrote about. They did this, a study was done of e-commerce executives, and they were asked how much void fill or space, I guess, empty void space there was in their cartons that they were shipping out. And their estimate, I guess, on average was 25%. And after a study, it was shown that it was closer to 50%, which is kind of
Right.
astounding.
Yeah.
So, just I guess as a plug for maybe executives out there, maybe look a little closer into your shipping and see what you can do to make sure that you're optimizing that.
Yeah, I think the key is not to eyeball it, because, like I said, like humans are just really bad at this. We're bad at this, at eyeballing it, because we look at packing solutions that our system has generated pretty much all day long, and because we're nerds, we're like, oh, that's a beautiful pack. It must be 87% full. And then we look at
Mm-hmm.
the actual numbers and it's like 53. So it's really just like even people that think about this niche problem all day long have a hard time estimating these things. So I would say if you're going to evaluate this, just make sure you have a pencil handy so that you can actually get the actual figures instead of eyeballing it. Because that'll give you a sense of, all right, what's the potential here? Even if cubic volume is not a perfect stand-in for lowest cost, it still kind of is. So it's worth seeing how you're doing today.
Yeah. To kind of wrap up, is there anything that you wish you were asked about more, about like cartonization, or something that you wish people realized more than they do when they come talk to you?
Oh man, that's a great question. Well, I get questions about scope 3 emissions, but I think in the companies we're talking to, I know many of them are thinking about the fact that scope 3 emissions reporting is going to become law maybe someday soon in the United States. It kind of already is in Europe.
Could you explain? I'm not sure what that is. So,
Sure. So emissions are kind of classified into different categories. So scope 1 and 2 emissions are things that you create within your four walls. So it might be I'm leaving the lights on all night for no reason. That's a scope 1 or 2 emission, I forget. Scope 3 emissions are the kind that you cause. So it could be the material that you buy, or it could be the FedEx trucks that you cause to
okay.
uh, roll around outside your warehouse. I think that there's not really a good understanding amongst executives about what that means. And so that's the thing that I think we're trying to tell our current customers, at least, that they need to keep an eye on this, because at some point they're going to be forced, especially if they're a public company, forced to report these numbers to the government, and it's not not an easy thing. And so that's definitely something.
So, just out of my own curiosity, with it possibly becoming law, would it be that like companies are held to some, they have to be below some amount of emissions?
I don't know where the specifics of the law will stand after it runs the gauntlet through legislation for, or industry lawsuits and things like that. But I just know that it's going to suddenly be in the public consciousness, and companies like Amazon, I don't know if they'll be held to some standard, but it's suddenly going to be kind of shocking, I think, because all the empty boxes that or mostly empty boxes that we get from them, they're kind of just like, they're, they optimize for speed above all else. I think it'll, even out of sheer embarrassment, might force companies like that to try to fix this problem.
Yeah.
I know that there's also a legislation in the EU that's going to require a certain amount of cubic utilization in e-commerce shipments. I think it's like 64% or something, which sounds like an easy threshold to cross, but most shippers, when they come to us, they're doing way less than that. So we'll have to keep an eye out to see if that kind of law comes to the US as well. There's already some local laws on the books in certain US states about how empty certain packages are and fines associated with those.
Oh. Yeah, that could be a major wake-up call for a lot of shippers, I think, that aren't even considering it or aren't worried about it, or, optimize for other things over that.
Right.
So, okay, well, thanks for your time today, James. I know I learned a lot about cartonization and other things. So if you're looking to improve your shipping, your packaging, packing, reach out to James. You can reach him on Facebook. Probably Facebook, LinkedIn for sure, at James Malley, or at Paccurate.io. So thanks again, James, for your time.
Thanks so much, Aaron. This was great.